Despite its uninspiring name, the American submarine chaser USS PC-1264 has a very important place in US naval history. This was one of the first ships, together with the USS Mason, to operate with a predominantly African American crew. More importantly than this, PC-1264 ended its career with an entirely African American crew, including its commanding officer. Considering that racial segregation dogged almost every aspect of American life at the time, and casual racism was endemic in all areas of life, including the military, this was a truly important historical event. USS PC-1264 and USS Mason, the only two American warships with mostly black crews in the Second World War, were instrumental in forcing the US military to re-evaluate its racial policies. PC-1264 was built to intercept German submarines operating off of the US East Coast. She was commissioned on the 25th of April 1944. At the ceremony, the vessel's crew stood to attention alongside the officers, those ranks still being filled with white servicemen at the time. The flag was raised and the crew listened to speeches given by the commanding officer, Lieutenant Eric Purdon. Family members and interested New Yorkers lined the harbour to watch the ceremony, many of them undoubtedly intrigued by the all-African American crew. At the start of its service life, all of the ship's officers and all of the petty officers were white. However, by November 1944, all of the petty officers were transferred and the ranks were taken up by African American servicemen promoted from the ship's crew. Before the ship entered active duty, both it and the crew underwent a period of training and running in. It was during this time that the black sailors experienced open racism despite being serving wartime seamen. When stationed in Miami, the crew were due to take their swimming test at a municipal pier that had been used for recruits from all over the region. On the day of the test, the pier and beach were closed as they refused to train the so-called Negro sailors. Once again, also whilst in Miami, the crew had to put up with harassment from the civilian guards who manned the gates to their base, their main amusement being to waste extra time checking and rechecking the men's documents. However, one evening things took a more sinister twist. Whilst drinking in a nearby Miami bar that served African Americans, some white sailors overheard a group of locals plotting to come onto the base and shoot up the ship. The sailors returned to the base, took rifles and pistols and went to the gates where the civilian guards were to await the local angry racists. In the end, they never arrived, but the incident must have spooked the guards because after that, they never held up the 1264's crew again. But such incidents shouldn't be taken as defining the crew's experience entirely. For instance, when tied up one night near West Point Military Academy, many of the men were treated to a special tour of the facility and were taken by buses especially laid on for them. The United States is a big and wonderfully varied place, and of course not every citizen shared the same views as the hostile Floridians who threatened the crew in Miami. On her first independent sailing following test runs, PS-1264 experienced trouble at about 10:35 AM. Rapidly she lost power and was left dead in the water. Eventually a naval tugboat dragged her back to port, where she arrived sometime around midnight, nearly 14 hours after losing power at sea. On July the 10th, 1944, the vessel reported for duty in New York. Over the next few months, she escorted convoys between New York and Cuba, or from Charleston, South Carolina to New York. On one voyage to Guantanamo Bay, Cuba, the 1264 engaged an enemy object for 3 whole hours, but no sign was ever found of an enemy ship. It was either never there or it escaped their fire. By September 1944, the crew had a lucky escape when they discovered the engine mounts had cracked. If left unrepaired, this risked sending the engine off of its supports, which would unbalance the vessel and ultimately sink it. She was quickly sailed to port for repairs. Days later, the convoy she was due to escort sailed into a hurricane-force storm at sea. Had the 1264 been alongside them with a cracked engine mount, she almost certainly would have sunk with the crew. In January 1945, a Nazi spy was captured and revealed that Germany intended to use submarines to fire V-1 and V-2 rockets at American targets on the East Coast. In response, the 1264 subchaser was ordered to patrol the Atlantic between Long Island and Chesapeake Bay in Virginia. By April 1945, the ship was given its first command as head of a convoy of 30 merchant vessels sailing from Charleston, South Carolina. During the voyage, she and other naval vessels engaged the German submarine U-548, which was destroyed by depth charges on the 29th of April 1945 near Halifax, Nova Scotia. Only 8 days later, the Nazis surrendered, but for the crew of the US PC-1264, their duties continued. She was tasked with patrolling the American Atlantic coast in case of attacks from rogue Nazi vessels who refused to obey the surrender. By August 1945, the ship and her crew once again found themselves in Miami and once again faced racial hostility. One night, when drinking in a local bar, crew member Samuel L. Gravely was arrested by military police officers from the shore patrol for impersonating an officer. He had been drinking in an officer's uniform. The trouble was, Gravely was a high-ranking officer on the ship who was drinking in his own uniform. He would, in fact, go on to become the very first African American to command a Navy ship, the first African American to become a flag officer, and the first African American to reach the rank of Vice Admiral of the US Navy. That night, the MP chose to pick on the wrong guy. If you want to know more about Vice Admiral Gravely, I have put a link in the description to an interview where he describes enlistment and life in the US Navy in World War II. It's well worth checking out. In honour of the ship's stellar record, President Truman selected the 1264 to take part in a prestigious presidential review on Navy Day in October 1945. Only 47 vessels were selected, and whilst Truman did not board the ship, the President nonetheless circled the vessel whilst waving to her crew. On 7th of February 1946, the crew once again stood on parade on the deck of the 1264, but this time for her decommissioning ceremony after less than 2 years of naval service. Eventually she was sold for scrap, but fascinatingly the subchaser and racially pioneering vessel still sits today in the Don John Marine Yard in New York, a rusting relic of the bygone days of racial segregation, of wartime heroism, of Nazi submarine wolf packs terrorising the Atlantic, and of victory for the Allied powers in protecting the democratic way of life on both sides of the Atlantic. A victory only gained by the gruelling dedication of brave people just like the men aboard the USS PC-1264. If you like this video, then please check out my other video about the USS Mason, which should be down below. If you enjoy these kind of clips, then maybe you should consider subscribing. Thank you for watching.